Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army in Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to episode 11 of the podcast. It just happens to fall nicely, it being about the 11th Light Dragoons. And it's the first of a three-part series looking at the 4th Brigade of British Cavalry, Vandeleur's Brigade, comprising the 11th, 12th and 16th Light Dragoons. In this episode, we'll hear all about the 11th Light Dragoons, with some extraordinary tales coming up, especially in the years following Waterloo. In the 1815 campaign, the regiment consisted of 452 all ranks, 23 officers, and 429 other ranks. Let's start, as always, by looking at who the men of the regiment were and where they were from. So the first striking thing about this regiment was how exceptionally English it was, with even less non-Englishmen in it than the household cavalry regiments. There's birthplace data for 400 of the 429 other ranks, so 93%. And we can see that it was virtually entirely English, with just 7 men in total from either Scotland, Ireland or Wales. So that's 98% English. It's difficult to account for this level of homogeneity, especially as the regiment had spent 1807 to 1810 stationed in Ireland. If anyone has any theories, do let me know. In terms of counties, there's a broad spread with a handful of men from most English counties. Hampshire, Suffolk, Kent and Lancashire have a few more than most, and then Staffordshire, with 42 men, has double their numbers. But Yorkshire is by far the standout county, with 91 men, accounting for a quarter of the regiment in 1815. It's starting to be noticeable across this series how prominent Yorkshire was as a source for the British Army in this period. Within Yorkshire, a dozen men came from Sheffield, 9 from Huddersfield, 5 from Leeds, and the rest scattered across the county. In terms of length of service, well, there is enlistment data for all but 40 of the men, so 91%, and we can see looking at this graph that the highest numbers of intake were in 1812 to 1814, with 106 men joining in 1813 or later. But to better understand what this graph tells us in terms of combat experience, we should first have a quick potted history of the regiment in the preceding 2 decades or so. Now, 30 old soldiers had served in Holland way back in 1799, and half of those had seen even earlier action, being present in the campaign in Germany between 1793 and 1795. The regiment next went to war in the Peninsula in May 1811 and served throughout that year and 1812. While heavy cavalry were generally used to strike a hammer blow in battle, light cavalry were employed in a far more varied range of roles as reconnaissance, scouting out the enemy, probing their positions, acting as vanguards and rearguards, and generally playing a crucial role in the war of movement in which Wellington had embarked in those years. Such soldiering in the outposts required skill and experience, and in those early days, the 11th, being mostly new to it all, had neither. Almost as soon as they arrived in the peninsula, disaster befell them. Just 3 weeks after landing, Captain Benjamin Lutyens was out with his troop when it was entirely surrounded by a much larger French force. 8 of the 11th were killed, 22 wounded, and 77 men and officers taken prisoner. Captain Tompkinson of the 16th Light Dragoons wrote in his journal,
"The picket was badly posted and the ground not explained to Captain Lutyens. It was probably the first picket he ever mounted, and on seeing the enemy's troops on the road he looked to retreat, but had not the wits quite about him."
Further misfortune followed not long afterwards. A patrol of 10 men led by Lieutenant Frederick Wood went out on patrol on 15th of August 1811 at San Martin de Trebaja, just over the Portuguese border into Spain, and all were taken prisoner. Despite these setbacks, the regiment provided essential light cavalry support throughout the rest of the year and into 1812, and was present first at the storming of Badajoz in April 1812, then the Battle of Salamanca in June, as well as minor skirmishes too numerous to list. The regiment next played an unpleasantly active role as part of the army's rearguard during the dreadful retreat from Burgos in late October 1812. Several men of the 11th at Waterloo carried scars from the rearguard action of Venta del Poz. Private George Forbert, for example, received a sabre cut across his neck, and another 6 men were captured by the French during this month. The gruelling effects of the retreat from Burgos on both men and horses, a general spread of sickness throughout the regiment, on top of the losses in men captured or wounded in 1811, led to the decision to send the regiment back to England. They handed over their horses and returned in 1813. However, at least 38 men and officers in the 11th at Waterloo had not returned to England in 1813, being in French captivity as prisoners of war, where they would remain, often in extremely grueling conditions, until their eventual return after the Peace of 1814. So, to return to this graph of enlistment, we can see that around 70% had battle experience from 1811, 1812 or earlier, with the large intake of 1813 being men brought in to replace those losses of the Peninsula. A key source for this episode, for the 11th, are the memoirs of Private George Farmer, a Cockney from Cripplegate who had enlisted in 1808. Although ghostwritten by a more educated author, he provides one of the most colourful insights into life in the period from a man in the ranks, and is an extraordinary read. He was among the unfortunate 77 captured in their first foray into the Spanish countryside in June 1811, and so provides us with a unique account of life as a prisoner of war during this period. He then describes returning to the regiment in 1814, gives us valuable descriptions of the regiment at Waterloo, and then even more unique insights into the extraordinary events that befell the 11th in the years after the wars, much more of which later. Now that we know who these men were and some of what they'd been through in the Peninsula, let's now join them in the campaign of 1815. The regiment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Slay and Major Archibald Money, and comprised 6 troops commanded by the following officers, listed in order of seniority: Bouchier's troop, Lucian's troop, Schreiber's troop, Jenkins' troop, Binney's troop, and Double's troop. Each troop consisted of around 70 officers and men. On the regiment arriving at Ostend, the transport ship in which they had crossed the Channel could not get close enough to the shore to disembark, and so the entire regiment was required to swim their horses from the transport to the Ostend beach. As we've heard with other regiments, May and June was spent moving around the area between Ghent and Brussels and practicing drill and field exercises. On the 16th of June, the regiment was stationed at the village of Vion, and in the morning was still oblivious of the news of the French army's approach. The brigade played no part in the Battle of Catar, arriving after the fighting had finished, despite a very hard forced march. However, on the following day, the 17th of June, part of the regiment was engaged, and their role has been largely overlooked in histories of the battle. We heard in the very first episodes of this podcast of the Life Guards being called upon to charge the French vanguard at Genappe after the British 7th Hussars had been unable to make an impression on the French Lancers. Well, it seems that the 11th Light Dragoons were also required to come to the assistance of the 7th. Captain James Schreiber of the 11th recalls passing quietly through Genappe when suddenly,
at about a quarter of a mile on the Brussels side, the 7th Hussars passed us at speed, right and left of the road in all directions, having been evidently much harassed. I immediately halted and fronted, and, when they were clear, charged and drove the French cavalry back into the town of Genappe. We were then obliged to retire, which was perfected in good order, and I rejoined my regiment the same evening about 9 o'clock.
That line, "we were then obliged to retire," is one of those lines groaning under the weight of understatement, and suggests that the 11th did not have things all their own way, that there was a fair bit of back and forth throughout this part of the withdrawal, the French cavalry vanguard probing and creeping inexorably forward, and the British cavalry being forced to repeatedly turn and chase off their pursuers. We know Lieutenant James Moore of Binney's troop received 3 lance wounds at Genappe, and by studying individual soldiers' documents at the Public Record Office in Kew, it's apparent that the 11th Right Squadron, comprising the 2 troops of Binney and Schreiber, were actively engaged. For example, the discharge papers of Sergeant Samuel Widders of Schreiber's troop, funnily enough born in Kew, Surrey, include a specific recommendation to the pension board from the 11th's colonel.
In the several battles that he has been engaged, he has been distinguished for his bravery, and particularly on the 17th of June, the day previous to the Battle of Waterloo, when his gallantry was eminently conspicuous.
That night, on reaching the position behind the crest of the Allied line that they would occupy at Waterloo the following day, the torrential rain was unrelenting. Private George Farmer writes,
"The rain, which fell in torrents and had done so for hours before our arrival, soon reduced the face of the country to a state of swamp, and as our bivouac was formed in a ploughed field, the comparative comforts of our situation require no poet's art to describe them. At every step which you took, you sank to your knees, and your foot, when you dragged it to the surface again, came loaded with some 20 pounds of clay."
In the morning of the 18th, the men of the 11th fed and watered their horses, and set about rubbing them down and cleaning their own clothes and equipment. Most men had not brought any food with them, so great had the rush been on the 16th, and hunger was now combining with the night's cold and wet to sap the strength of even the most hardened old campaigners. The regiment joined the rest of the brigade, the 12th and 16th Light Dragoons, in close columns, and waited for battle to begin. From their position they had a good view of the battlefield, and Private Farmer describes seeing the endless columns of the French spread out as far as the eye could see. Farmer also describes how an ADC came galloping over to the regiment and ordered one squadron of the 11th and one of the 12th to advance and see off some French lancers who were threatening the Allied guns. The time and chronology is unclear. Perhaps these were lancers of Jacquinot's brigade, pressing on after chasing away the British heavy cavalry attack. Whatever, Farmer is frank in how this advance of the 11th literally came a cropper.
"We went at them with good will, but not perhaps perfect judgment. We did not consider that, when the ground is soft and heavy, the charge downhill is, of all operations to which the cavalry can be put, the most unsafe, and the consequence was that, rushing over the ridge at speed, very many of our horses came down, and we lost all order. The result need hardly be stated. The squadron of the 12th, which led, was almost cut to pieces, and we, with difficulty and in great disorder, recovered the brigade."
Although keen to immediately make amends, the 11th remained in position for the ensuing hours, frustrated at the passive role in which they were employed. They were still the subject of sustained French artillery fire, but due to their being positioned behind the crest of the hill, it was actually the regiments behind them who suffered worse casualties from the bouncing round shot. Later, an order came for the 11th to form line and move to their left, but their role in this new position was still one of a covering reserve. A battalion of Brunswick infantry seemed on the point of wavering, and the 11th had been moved behind them to encourage them to remain. The Light Dragoons drew their swords, cheered and made their horses prance. This had the desired effect on the Brunswickers, who, according to Farmer,
perceiving there was support at hand, took up their arms, which some of them had thrown away, and they throughout the remainder of the action behaved with all the gallantry for which their countrymen have in every age and country been remarkable.
With the situation stable, the regiment was ordered to dismount, not only to reduce the likelihood of being hit by a stray French cannonball, but also to give the horses and men a rest, having been mounted since dawn. Only at the close of day, as dusk started to draw in, and the Allied infantry at last were ordered to form line in advance, were the 11th finally called upon to mount and go on the attack. Their target was a French artillery battery. Farmer writes,
"On we went at a gallop, dashing past the wary yet gallant footmen, and, shouting as we went, drove fiercely and without check up to the very muzzles of the hostile battery. A furious discharge of grape met us and thinned our ranks. Before it, man and horse went down, but the survivors, never putting bridle or pausing to look back, scattered the gunners to the winds, and the cannons were ours."
Lieutenant Colonel Slay describes the same charge.
We took the last battery and received their last fire, which was given when the brigade, then under my command, was so close that I saw the artillerymen fire their guns. Fortunately, the ground was undulating and we only lost Lieutenant Phelps of the 11th Dragoons and A of the 16th Dragoons.
Lieutenant Edward Phelps was killed, decapitated by a French cannonball. From the National Army Museum, an account from Cornet Henry Bullock.
Poor Philip was killed by a cannon shot as we were advancing. The next shot, from a howitzer, wounded my horse each side of my leg and cut my girths half in two.
By now, darkness was falling, and with it the risk of friendly units misidentifying each other in the gloom greatly increased. As Wellington's army pressed forward, the 4th Brigade very nearly charged the 1st Hussars of the King's German Legion. Lieutenant Colonel Slay again.
When continuing our advance, the 1st Hussars came up in the rear of the brigade, and from its being nearly dark were all but in collision with the 11th and 16th, which regiments, knowing there was a brigade of French cavalry on our right, went threes about and were in act of charging, when they recognised the 1st Hussars by knowing their cheer. It was very dark.
This little detail is interesting in that it indicates different regiments had recognisably different cheers before charging, perhaps like football crowds having different chants and songs. It's also a good example of the importance of experience. The men of the 4th Brigade only recognised the cheer of the King's German Hussars, having fought alongside them in the Peninsula back in 1811 and 1812. The 11th ended the day rounding up French prisoners and, exhausted, handed over the pursuit of Napoleon's army to the Prussians, but at last lay down next to their horses in front of a wood and bivouacked for the night. Overall, casualties were relatively light. As we can see here, just 6 men killed or died of wounds, and 23 wounded. Schreiber's troop suffered the worst casualties, reflecting no doubt their skirmishing on the 17th of June north of Genappe, while Jenkins' troop had the lowest casualties of any British cavalry troop at Waterloo, with just 2 men wounded. As is often the case, there was a disproportionate number of officers wounded. Captain Schreiber, who was badly wounded by a round shot which broke his horse's back, and 4 lieutenants. 2 sergeants and a private would later be discharged due to their Waterloons, as was Private William Hopkins from Bath. He was the Batman to one of the officers and was in the process of cleaning one of his master's pistols when it accidentally fired, by which poor Private Hopkins lost 2 fingers. After Waterloo, the regiment formed part of the Army of Occupation in France, and did not return until late 1818. During these 3 years, many of the men formed romantic attachments with the local French girls. One of the men smitten was Sergeant William Tongue of Jenkins' troop from Bermondsey, South London, who, having fallen in love with a French girl, was heartbroken to lose her to a French hussar in October 1816. Sergeant Tongue took 2 pistols and, despite the desperate pleas of his comrades, placed one inside his mouth and blew his brains out. A happier outcome came for Private Thomas Griffin, who, on his discharge, returned to his home of Yoxford in Suffolk with his French wife, Catherine. Returning to England in 1818, the regiment was briefly stationed in Canterbury, where, just before Christmas, men of the 11th were engaged in an almighty punch-up with men of the 12th Lancers, the cause apparently being aspersions cast by the 12th on the conduct of the 11th in France, and was on such a scale that the local infantry garrison had to be called out to break it up. The following year, the regiment received the stunning news that its next posting would be to India, and here begins what would become the final chapter in a truly tragic number of the men's lives. The regiment would not return to England for nearly 20 years, and while in India would suffer terribly from the climate and illness. The devastating loss of life was not reported in England. In terms of coverage in the British press, it may as well have gone to Mars or ceased to exist. And it's largely thanks to the remarkable memoirs of George Farmer that we have any witness accounts of the hardships and losses incurred by the regiment. That and the regimental records which reveal the following shocking statistics. Of 423 other ranks, we know what became of 389 of them, or 92%. Of those 389, 92 men had left the regiment before it set sail for India in 1819, so that leaves about 300 men boarding the Indiaman ships, of which 138 would die of illness, mostly in the first 7 years. As we can see here, the worst year was 1820, when an outbreak of cholera or typhoid wiped out a huge proportion of the regiment, including 45 Waterloo men. So these Waterloo men had scarcely better than a 50% chance of ever returning to England. The 11th were far from being the only Waterloo regiment to suffer this fate, as we'll see in future episodes, but such a long posting to such a lethal environment does seem almost cruel. I feel particularly sorry for those men, and there are 9 of them, who had spent years of hardship as prisoners of war after capture in the peninsula, only to be shipped off to India to die. The wills of many of the men who died in these outbreaks can be found at Kew. Here we see the spidery signature of Private John Welton from Cheadle in Staffordshire, presumably scrawled from his deathbed in 1823. It's touching to note that almost without exception, the only thing of value which the men had to bestow was their Waterloo medal, and many of the wills make specific mention of who they wish their medal to go to. Private John Gilman from Canterbury, for example, died at Cawnpore in 1827.
The Waterloo Medal of Private John Gilman has been given to Private John Bodkin, his cousin, according to his dying request.
Officers fared no better than the men, and both Captain Thomas Binney and Lieutenant William Smith died in India, and unsurprisingly the regiment surgeon at Waterloo and the assistant surgeon, James Marley and Henry Steele, also both lost their lives during outbreaks of illness. And those men who did survive were often rendered quite decrepit by the relentless bouts of illness to which even the most hardened veteran of India could still succumb. Take, for example, Private William Morby in Schreiber's troop at Waterloo. By 1832, the surgeon observed,
"Very good health until 1828, when he suffered several attacks of fever, which undermined his health considerably. He was in consequence sent to the Himalayas for the hot season in 1829. Although he has been very little in hospital since his return, he has lost all of his teeth and is so infirm as to be unequal to perform the duty of a soldier, his constitution impaired by repeated attacks of fever."
I will never cease finding it fascinating to imagine ordinary men of this period from quiet rural villages in the British Isles, where many of their neighbours might not have travelled far enough to ever have even left their county in their lifetimes, finding themselves in far-flung corners of the globe, in unfamiliar worlds so alien as to be almost incomprehensible. This Private Morby, for example, one can only wonder what adventures and ordeals he had experienced in his life. Born in Broughton, Oxfordshire, a village of less than 200 people, embarking on the round trip of over 1,000 miles from Cawnpore to Simla and back for the benefits of his health, setting eyes on the Himalayas, and then another long sea voyage back to his dotage in Oxfordshire. Added to the burdens of the harsh climate and disease, many of the men did not help themselves by the manner in which they lived. Alcoholism and other vices were common among the garrisons of India. Private John Fisher, a Wolverhampton man, had lost his stripes in 1832 due to his heavy drinking, and also had other health issues. The surgeon's report:
"To hospital with gonorrhea, March 1832. Then in hospital 5 times with syphilis from October 1832 to July 1835. October 1835 with dysentery, followed by nocturnal pains. This man has been a non-commissioned officer and drank very hard at times, and there can be very little doubt that his mode of life has tended to confirm disease. He has now been in hospital under treatment since his last admission, a period of 11 months. He is recommended to be sent to Europe for a change of climate."
Although garrison life could be dull, in December 1825 the regiment was once more called into action when it formed part of the British and Sepoy force under Lord Combermere in the siege and storming of Burt Hall. The regiment played no part in the actual storming, but was engaged in their light cavalry role in scouting the perimeter of the fort. I believe it was something like 8 miles in perimeter, and ensuring supplies and reinforcements could not get through. At least 120 Waterloo men from the 11th Light Dragoons took part in the campaign, and in 1851, only 25 years overdue, surviving men would be awarded the Army of India Medal. Overall, the regiment doesn't seem to have had much rub of the green. From their inauspicious start in the peninsula, and then their 18-year posting to India, the regiment would finally return to England in 1837, but even then, straight into the jaws of more misfortune, this time in the form of a newly appointed commanding officer, the Earl of Cardigan. A pretty abominable man by most measures, Cardigan took an instant dislike to any officer in the regiment who had served in India, where he said the climate had made them lazy. Although he's famous to us now for his role in the charge of the Light Brigade in 1854, he was already a household name long before then, infamous for being a martinet and for the black bottle scandal of 1840. But by then, there were barely any Waterloo men left in the 11th. Just 3 officers present with the regiment at Waterloo still remained. Captain Jenkins and Lieutenant James Rotten were now majors, and the extraordinary Lieutenant Bamford, who we'll hear all about in a moment. The last man from the ranks still serving was Private Thomas Shrimpton, from the village of Loudwater in Buckinghamshire, who was discharged in 1839, aged 43. His conduct described as very good, with a note that his name had never appeared in the regimental defaulters book. Let's now look at what became of some of the other survivors of the regiment. Lieutenant Frederick Wood's career was not a happy one. He had barely arrived in the peninsula, as we heard, when he was captured with his party of 10 men, allegedly while picking cherries in an orchard. He would spend the next 3 years in a prison at Verdun. At Waterloo he was wounded, and then, in August 1816, while stationed at Wormhout in France, he caused the greatest scandal by raging against the regiment's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Slay, in the officers' mess one evening. A court-martial followed, which presented 3 charges. Firstly, unofficer-like and disrespectful conduct towards Lieutenant Colonel Slay, his commanding officer, for in the presence of others denying that Slay had any command over him outside the field of active service, and secondly, in using reproachful and disrespectful speeches and gestures to him. The examples of these are quite amusing to read. For example,
I am a gentleman's son, and your conduct is condemned by all officers. You have put up with insults from the subalterns, and had better retreat. You are a coward, and I will not be trampled upon. We both cannot live in this world. You had better not drive me to extremities, or I will blow your brains out. I will shoot you!
Third charge was that Lieutenant Wood had challenged his superior officer to a duel and upbraided him for refusing the challenge. The court initially judged that there was not sufficient evidence to convict Lieutenant Wood and acquitted him. However, this was not a verdict which met with the Duke of York's approval, the commander of the British Army. So the case was heard again until the correct verdict was found. This time, the court announced that Lieutenant Wood was to be cashiered, the term for being booted out of the service. But this also was not what the Duke of York wanted, so he stepped in once more and beneficently reduced the sentence to being placed on half pay. As a footnote, during the Black Bottle scandal of 1840, Lieutenant Colonel Slay was involved, first in being present at the initial incident, and then in heading a board of inquiry. During this period, a number of letters to the editor were published by some newspapers, claiming that Slay, by now a Major General, had always been an impossible bully, that most of the Waterloo officers had resigned or transferred rather than serve under him in India, and generally smearing his character. This correspondence was anonymous, but signed from an officers' club, and I do wonder if the author might actually have been Lieutenant Frederick Wood. At the other end of the spectrum, in terms of military career, comes Private Robert Bambrick, one of the most extraordinary stories of any of the men from the ranks in the British Army at Waterloo. His life would make a good film, a real-life Richard Sharp, albeit with a tragic and macabre ending. Born in Canterbury, he enlisted in 1813 and served in Schreiber's troop at Waterloo. He was gradually then promoted to corporal, then sergeant, until commissioned and appointed riding instructor in 1820. 7 years from private to officer was extremely unusual, and indicates he must have been a quite extraordinary individual. In 1825 he rose to lieutenant, serving throughout the regiment's years in India, until the Earl of Cardigan era, when, after 30 years in the regiment, he finally left, to become a captain in the 7th Dragoon Guards. With this regiment, he sailed to the Cape Colony, what is now South Africa, where the regiment was engaged in what was then called the Kaffir War, but is now termed the 7th Xhosa War, or the War of the Axe. On the 6th of April 1846, after some cattle had been stolen by the local Xhosa, Bambrick was sent out with his troop. He appears to have pressed on too far, and on entering a thicket of bushes and shrubs, was killed and hacked to pieces. The London Illustrated News published this scene to accompany a typically lurid Victorian account.
He must have received many wounds. His charger galloped past the troop without its rider, its trappings, and saddle covered with blood, the savages bearing off the mangled body of their victim to mutilate or burn it, and brandishing his sword on the top of the hill as they retreated. Captain Bambrick was 47 years of age and had served his country more than 30 years.
So ended a truly eventful life. A gentler, more peaceful story comes in the rise of Private Christopher Chapman. From the village of West Leighton, where Yorkshire borders County Durham, he'd enlisted in 1805, aged 17, and served through the 11th's 2 years in the Peninsula, receiving a sabre wound in the wrist while on picket at Burgos. At Waterloo, he served as personal orderly to Wellington, a role in which he must have impressed, as Wellington kept him on as valet for the next 3 years of occupation in France. Chapman then went with the regiment to India, served the full 18 years there, was present at Bhurtpore, and on his discharge in 1837 re-entered service for the Duke, becoming a servant at Walmer Castle, Wellington's home in Kent. 3 of the 11th's young officers, aged between 18 and 20 at Waterloo, lived into ripe old age. George Schreiber from Wickham Market, Suffolk, the younger brother of Captain James Schreiber that we heard from earlier, died in 1878, aged 83 at Cheltenham. Cornet Philip Houghton James from Godmanchester in Huntingdonshire died in Kensington in 1880, aged 85. But Barton Parker Brown from Tiverton died in Bath in 1889, aged 92. Almost certainly the last of the Waterloo men of the 11th Light Dragoons, and among the last survivors of the battle across all its armies. So that brings us to the end of this episode on the 11th Light Dragoons. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe if you did. Remember, the podcast is now also available on platforms such as Spotify or Podbean. Many thanks as always to the brilliant contributors reading the extracts. Next time we'll be looking at the 2nd Regiment in this brigade, the 12th Light Dragoons, who were far more engaged in combat in the battle, as we shall see. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.